Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th session of Asia Venturing, a series of monthly roundtables with roadmaps to the future, focusing on the hype and the reality of Asia's supply chain boosted innovation ecosystem, jointly powered by DIGITIMES and Anchor Taiwan. We bring together leading industry luminaries, corporate strategists, experienced investors, and entrepreneurs to expand your network and redefine the possibilities of cross-border innovation. This is Elisa Chu, founder and CEO of Anchor Taiwan, and the host for today's session, where we will explore the great convergence between hardware and software, digital and real economies, and why industrial tech is the next big thing. Did you know that a record $45 billion went into industrial and supply chain startups in 2021? COVID accelerated global investments into a growing spectrum of technologies that will ultimately offer an unprecedented level of visibility, predictability, and efficiency for industrial tech. When it comes to the term industrial tech, while it could be loosely or strictly defined, we find that generally founders and investors alike have included verticals such as manufacturing, logistics, mobility, energy, healthcare, and more. Together, these verticals account for more than half of the global GDP. However, due to the nature of higher entry barriers with capital requirements and deep domain expertise needed in both hardware and software, it has not been the shining object chased by most entrepreneurs, nor has it been more commonly seen in the media. However, why do we think a great convergence is coming, and why do we call it a hardware renaissance? Today, I am beyond thrilled to have two industry veterans joining us for a deep discussion. First, let's welcome Nicolas Sauvage, president at TDK Ventures, dialing in from San Francisco. Hello, Nicola. How are you this morning, and how is San Francisco treating you?
Well, first, thank you, Elisa, for inviting me to your show. Everything is very nice here in the Bay Area, and I look forward to a very good conversation with you.
Fantastic. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Nicolas Sauvage. I'm the president of TDK Ventures. It's a corporate VC arm of TDK Corporations. You probably remember TDK from the audio cassette, but we have moved on. So now we are delivering solutions and products across energy transformation, like batteries and power supplies, to digital transformations, everything to connect the analog world to the digital world, like sensors and actuators, but also software solutions and modules that goes with it. And TDK Ventures invest in 6 big categories. First, next-gen materials, which is really these advanced materials which TDK is really world-class experts in. The second one is anything to do with energy and clean tech, which really matters for the sustainability of our planet. The next one is about connectivity and computing, which we all require for all the data and gaining insights into this data. Next is industry, industrial, like you mentioned before. And then next is mobility, everything to do with moving things and moving people around. And the last one, but not least, is health tech. And so we tend to invest in these 6 categories. So far, we've invested in 25 startups across all of them.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction. And as far as I know, Nicola, yourself lived in Taiwan for over a decade before. And when I was doing the research, I also was very pleased to find out that TDK actually, its first overseas branch was in Taiwan in the 60s. So I think there's a lot that we can dive into in terms of how a cassette tape makers became really such an important player in industrial tech. So I cannot wait to deep dive with you. But before that, next to you, we also have Ken Forster from Momenta dialing in from Zurich in Switzerland. Hello, Ken. How are you this afternoon?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having us join this wonderful assembly of people today.
Fantastic. And I will also love to hear a bit of your journey when it comes to industrial tech.
Oh man, well that could be a long story because I've probably been in this space a little over 30 years, but I'll set that aside. So I'm the exec director at Momenta, and we are the leading digital industry venture capital and private equity firm. We accelerate deep tech innovators across energy, manufacturing, smart spaces, and supply chain, which for us includes transportation. And we do that by working in three facets. One, we make strategic investments. Two, we help large strategics in the space acquire digital capabilities. And three, we help place key executive talent to help run those businesses many times as well. So for over a decade, yes, we're 10 years old now. Our team of deep digital industry practitioners really have helped scale 50 industry innovators to date. We've worked with about 150 operating technology companies, including Advantech, which is backing us on our most recent fund, Hitachi, which is actually one of our largest clients, Schneider Electric, Vestas, and many others.
And it's very interesting to see the setup with Momenta, including the venture capital side, but also corporate advisory with M&A, and also executive search with talent acquisition, which is really key for success, not just for startup, but for a lot of big corporates as well. And both of you are such an important, not just investors, but also ecosystem builders. I think Nicolas here, for example, is the CVC that has interviewed probably the most CVCs in recent years, collecting all of these insights and like information. And similarly with Ken, like you have built so many episodes with podcasts and so on and so forth, and great contribution to the ecosystem. And I believe that we're going to touch upon that a little bit in our discussion in terms of why you think that's the key elements for your success. Before that, though, back to today's topic when it comes to industrial tech. I wonder, let's say if you come across an unbeliever of industrial tech or someone who is not so familiar with the potential and also already the developments in this space, what would you say to this person so that this person will be like, wow, this is really an area that I need to look into? Why don't we start with you, Nicola?
Well, I think supply chain is going to be in need of innovations. It's already innovating so much, and there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 2 years. Let's talk about the pandemic. Let's talk about the geopolitical aspects. This is needing to move the supply chain from just in time and highly optimized and making sure that everything runs smoothly to a system that needs to be anti-fragile and that needs to address all of the disruption that can happen along the way. I'm looking for entrepreneurs that are going to embrace these disruptions and bring solutions to this anti-fragility requirement.
Great. Ken, what are you seeing from Europe? I know that you actually also operate both in Europe and also in the States as well, and then working with quite a lot of corporate partners here in Asia. What are you seeing from your side?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Let me go back to your question a moment ago, though, in terms of unbelievers. And it's interesting. I don't think there are any unbelievers in digital tech because we are all benefits from the outcomes of that. It's the automobiles we drive, it's the energy we use to light and warm our homes, it's the food we eat, right? I think the real question you're asking is this an investable space for traditional VC? And for Momenta, we believe, when we founded the company in 2012, this is our sole focus. And so we clearly believe that the industry, but more importantly, the digitization of that industry is absolutely critical. So some might call it the industrial Internet of Things. Others might call it digital thread, Industry 4 or even Industry 5 now. It's really the application of digital to accelerate traditional sectors. So what's this worth? I know you and I like to reference PitchBook, so I'm going to do that liberally here. But PitchBook says that the IoT market's worth $423 billion as of 2021, right? They predict, if you look at some of the high growth sectors within that, and particularly manufacturing and supply chain, 32% growth in the market cap collectively of those companies in 2021. It's huge, right? Smart buildings, they forecast to grow 15.9% CAGR through 2024. In fact, if you look across all of the verticals that they measure as part of that industrial IoT focus, there are none that are less than 11% CAGR through 2024, some as high as 20 to 30%. So all the way around, this is a very compelling space and a very interesting space, especially given some of the factors you mentioned earlier, COVID, supply chain disruption, et cetera. But we'll get to that in a few minutes.
I definitely think that, like for supply chains, I think a lot of time it's a vertical or a space that people only notice when there are issues. So I think definitely last 2 years, because of COVID, because of the geopolitical tensions, all of a sudden, this kind of like quiet giants started getting more and more attention. And I love what you mentioned in terms of now, more and more people realize the need. But I guess the next question is, how do we convince people and prove that this is indeed an investable space? Because then later on, I would love to also, related to this, touch up on whether the tech that we are seeing in this space bring incremental improvements for operations, or are we really seeing huge disruptions with unicorns, with IPOs and so on and so forth that would deliver the venture-backed kind of returns? And maybe back to you a little bit, Nicola, what are you seeing in the especially last 2-3 years or so since the inception of TDK Ventures in this space when it comes to the trend? If you were to compare that with what you used to see before, because you have been in this industry really for a long time as well. So we'd love to actually hear a little bit from you when it comes to the recent trends and whether there are notable differences in between Asia and the rest of the world.
So I will talk about recent trends, but I will touch on the word you use, which is investable. And when you think about venture capital, you need to invest when it's not yet obvious, so that you don't actually overpay. If it's obvious, everyone will want in, and so they will all want to price it higher. So you want to invest when it's not yet obvious. You can see some signals, you can see some trends emerging, but it's not obvious to everyone. But you also want to invest where something is going to be so massive, it's going to have an explosive growth, which is where you get to invest in companies, in startups that will serve this big market growth. And so when we talk about the recent trends, it's us betting on these trends accelerating, or it's us believing that these trends are not going away. And so we also try to build some contrarian views whenever possible. If I look at some examples, we believe that there is a need for green energy. And we believe it needs to be local. It needs to be at the point of use versus transporting it. And so we invested, for example, in a company called VII, which is a green hydrogen electrolyzer company that has a promise of being able to deliver this green energy where you need it, whether it's hyperscalers, whether it's factories, where it's needed. And hyperscalers, for example, is a trend that was not so obvious 10 years ago. It's becoming really obvious now. And it's an exponential growth. And it's driven by AI and data and all of that. Another trend which is becoming so obvious today is 3D printing. We invested in 2 3D printing companies. One was Origin, which is already acquired by the number one, strategists. And another one is Fabric8, which is doing some metal 3D printing company in a very, very special way. And here it's also about supply chain. Why do you need to ship finished product or nearly finished product all around the world if you can produce them with 3D printing locally? And so if we believe in these changes, in these big growth changes, then we can actually invest, and this is back to the investable, invest in companies that deliver needed innovations for what is going to become obvious in 5 years, but not today.
Thank you. And I think the 2 examples you gave definitely are very exciting innovations that I think very much needed in our society. And that actually brought me some questions around when I come across a lot of CVCs or even VCs working with corporate partners. Very often it's kind of like almost a prerequisite that they want the startups that they work with or they invest into to have quote unquote synergy with their certain BUs. So a lot of time when you want to have that, like first of all, for the two examples you gave, say for example, I'm not really sure whether there are direct synergies with the mothership itself. However, that's very common when we come across corporate partners seeking for this type of synergies when they look for investments. So that brought me to the questions that I touched upon a little bit just now when it comes to incremental and marginal improvements with the existing business model, existing operations, and so on and so forth? Or do we basically seek something that completely redefine the game plan and something that basically we built from the ground up? Because what I notice is that especially in Asia, we have a lot of OEM and ODM, EMS and so on and so forth. They're actually doing still okay, even though everybody is telling them that, hey, you need to look for transformations and so on and so forth. So imagine, I want to throw that question to both of you. If you were the CEO of, let's say, Foxconn or Samsung or Wistron or like any major Asia EMS, OEM, and ODM, how do you balance in between improving your existing business while looking for that next moonshot transformation bet that really can give you really that growth engine for not just the next 1 or 2 years and marginal kind of like improvement, but really that engine that will drive the success for your company for the next 10 years. I see Ken unmute yourself, so I think I will let you go.
Perfect. Look, what we believe is that partnership is a spectrum of activities. Typically, you might call it corporate development. You can commercially partner, you can strategically partner, you can minority invest, you can do joint ventures, you can do a controlling interest, you can do acquisition. And that's all a spectrum of what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. Since we're talking about investments and more traditionally minority investments here, one of the common reasons you do minority investments is to learn, right? If you want to make a disruptional change, you might try to acquire something. The challenge with that is you can destroy the very value you're trying to create as you integrate that value into a hardened DNA of whatever your company is, right? By investing, you can learn a lot around the industry, around kind of what your peers are up to in the space, around new use cases that are happening, around market expansion, right? So traditionally, we'll advocate minority investing really as an application of learning, as a application of trial. Co-creation is a very key part of that, i.e. we won't invest in a company out of our Fund 3, which is the one backed by Advantech, unless Advantech commits to some form of co-creation activities. It might be commercial, might be technical in terms of what they're working on. And we find we actually can create more value for Advantech, as an example, through co-creation than necessarily through the fund returns. And mind you, our fund returns are all 3rd and 4th quartile, right? So we get really good fund returns, but we're getting it through that co-creation effort. So I don't know if the question is one of disrupting. We'll take Casey Liu, the chairman of Advantech, whether he's thinking about disrupting Advantech or whether incrementally improving, because he's going to get aspects to both. But when he's ready to disrupt, I guarantee you by minority investment, he knows a lot more about the market. He's been able to test his thesis, and he'll make an acquisition in a space that he knows he can win at, right? And continue the glory of what Advantech has been able to do in terms of market growth.
In addition to that education and understanding what's going on in the markets, I think the key word I'm hearing here is co-creation. And also, maybe we should look at synergy in a broader sense. So this is probably not directly working with the BU to really kind of like have that incremental, just kind of like improvement, but overall, distribution channels, maybe kind of like legal, tax, talent acquisition, and so on and so forth. There are probably a lot of other areas that this external innovation can really bring in both inspirations, but also real benefits for the corporates. And for Nicola, what's your thoughts around this? And maybe if you want to quickly tell us a little bit around the king of the hill or queen of the hill concept.
I definitively will. But I will first pick on 2 things that Ken said, which are so critical. One is a need for learning, and this is a why you should do this type of minority equity investments. Betting on the entrepreneurs who are at the forefront of innovation, that's their life's project. So the number one thing that Ken said is just spot on, which is learning. The second one, it talks about co-creation. The way I look at it is it's how you do it and how you build an unfair advantage. Because at the end, entrepreneurs, the good ones, they can choose investors. I remember Ben Yu from Sierra Ventures told me something very simple. There is only two types of entrepreneurs. The ones that need your money and the ones that don't need your money. You only want to invest in the ones that don't need your money. And as a consequence, you need to build this unfair advantage where people want to choose you as investors. And the co-creation is one mechanism where you add so much value to the startup that the startup can actually accelerate their success and reduce risks along the way. And my advice to corporations when they think about this type of minority investments, of course, is to structure the corporate VC well and as a fund with the right partners in the right ecosystem, but to think about synergies not so much as what I'm getting, but what I am giving. And what I mean, for example, in TDK Ventures, we call it TDK Goodness. And TDK Goodness is all these synergies and things that we can do to help them as seen from the recipient. So it's not what we think is valuable, it's what we believe, the entrepreneurs are telling us is valuable. And so Elisa, when you talk about redefining the game plan for corporations, it's about being able to learn from these entrepreneurs. And this is where now I'm getting to your questions, and especially on the financial or strategic, they are combined because you're not going to get the same strategic learnings if you choose a market leader number 7. But you're going to get it if you find the entrepreneurs that's building the market leader number 1 into a new space. And that's what we call the king of the hill, or maybe we should start to call it queen of the hill. But the point is to find these entrepreneurs that we believe have a shot. Nothing is guaranteed, but they have a shot to become market leader number 1 in a given space that we want to learn, and we believe we can help them. So we have an ability to influence their outcome. We have the ability to bring the corporation and some of the things that we can contribute to their success. And that's what I think matters the most, is learning is a why. Finding an unfair advantage where we can help the entrepreneurs. This is really important. And then making sure we bet on the winners, the future winners. And at that point, financial and strategic are combined. It's one thing.
So basically, in order to learn, you have to prove that you're worthwhile. So you got to give first and make sure that you really support the entrepreneur, support the ecosystem so that you have that opportunity to participate and to learn. And I want to bring back and zoom in back to industrial tech a little bit. Very frequently, people talk about the whole supply chain, industrial tech, is going to be software defined. It's going to be software driven. And these days, probably not just industrial tech, almost everything. I hear this in mobility, in EVs, in like IoT and everything. And more than 10 years ago, Mark Andreessen obviously very famously stated that software is eating the world. And I also know that, like being in Taiwan around a lot of very, very powerful players in supply chain, especially when it comes to hardware manufacturing, I know that sometimes that software dominates the world kind of like statements get onto the nerve of some of the Asian, especially manufacturing players. So I would like to actually invite you to share a little bit when it comes to industrial tech in your space. Obviously, we talk a lot around hardware, software, integration, but then when it comes to that dynamics, what's the outlook? The Asian supply chain players would probably argue that hey, like without hardware, you cannot go anywhere. And if you're really serious about software, you really need to do hardware these days. What are you seeing when it comes to the opportunities around the dynamics in between these two, especially in the areas that you're investing into?
Here we'll start by going into the why we started TDK Ventures, which is the why of TDK. TDK has a mission for the last 86 years to contribute to society. And so what we have tried to do with TDK Ventures is to look at all the startups that have been traditionally underfunded. I'm talking about the deep tech, hardware, material science type of startups that did not get as much love as a software as a service type of startups that could show very nice margin very quickly. And so TDK Ventures is this kind of patient capital. In a way, we are patient and impatient. We are patient with capital. We have this sense of purpose, but we are also impatient. We believe that we need to act today to save the planet. So if I'm going to be cheeky, I'm going to say that maybe 10 years ago, software was eating the world. I think it's time for material science to build the world. And I would even go as far as to say to save the world with more clean tech, more climate tech, more sustainability focus than ever before.
Out of the 24 startups that you invested into, just like rough percentage, what's the sort of like percentage that are like purely software, and what's the percentage that would rely upon hardware software integration in order for them to really thrive?
I will actually say that all of them are hardware or material science, and all of them require some integration with software. All of them. There is no doubt that you need to build a solution, and it has to be a compelling solution. And so even if you're developing something really breakthrough on the material science, I'll give you the example of Metalens, which is one of our portfolio company leveraging the breakthrough in terms of using semiconductor technology to do optical solutions, okay? No longer these big optics, but this very flat semiconductor. And Metalens is basically doing this breakthrough material science, but they work with module makers, they work with software companies to develop really nice total solutions for OEMs to then deploy to their consumers. And so even though you might think this is really semiconductor deep tech solutions which we invested in, it actually does not matter if it doesn't get into an end solution. And to get to an end solution, it's a full ecosystem at play. And it includes software, module maker, OEMs, the whole gamut.
Fantastic, great example. And for Ken, what are you seeing?
As you said, Mark Andreessen said software was eating the world about 10 years ago, and then came back later on and qualified software platforms particularly. And so my question, certainly would be, what do we consider a platform, right? Is an automobile a platform, or do I have to have a cloud-based infrastructure behind it? So in some sense, I think Mark was absolutely right, but I also believe your stakeholders, as you said, are correct about the importance of hardware. It's called edgeware, right? Software that runs on hardware at the edge. So let me put this in perspective. The EU Commission today estimates that 80% of data is processed in the cloud and 20% at the edge. So think about where the work actually gets done, right? Factory floors, mobility, et cetera. By 2025, they forecast that this will be the inverse, right? 80% of data processing at the edge, right? What do you get? Hopefully, if you do it right, you get cloud-like ease of use, but with high reliability, low latency, performance at the edge. You also get some interesting things that we're talking about these days too, like data security, data sovereignty, right? Because the data is no longer sitting in a hyperscaler up in Washington State, right? And so the important part of this is that all of this is converging. In fact, we call it the hyper-converged edge, is a term we've come up with to describe hyper-convergence, which is a general topic in IT, but as it applies toward industry, right? And that's been a key tenet of our investing since our founding. So, while the winners in the cloud side have all pretty much been defined, the hyperscalers, as we said, the edge is much more diverse, right? If Europe has a claim, they claim that more than 50% of industrial devices are manufactured in Europe. So you can see why they're very excited about putting hardware and sensors and software on these devices to be able to make them services in some sense many times. Now imagine the impact of that to edge device manufacturers. You mentioned ODMs, OEMs, et cetera. In our perspective, the world's actually going to be a lot brighter for providers of hardware if they think about themselves being part of an edgeware stack. It's very specific why we partnered with Advantech, because you can't go to a factory floor pretty much anywhere without seeing their industrial PCs or edge gateways or other devices that are there. So for us, we think the trends are actually going to play very much in favor of hardware, and that those software platforms will eat the world, but it's all going to be done more and more at the edge versus in a handful of collective companies running the cloud.
Well, that's very interesting, especially given that currently the major cloud players, obviously, they're mostly US based. So with this shift, I think, that probably will add some interesting elements with the geopolitical dynamics globally in the world.
It will, but those we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a few minutes, but those dynamics are already happening. So the question is our current centralized cloud-based infrastructure the appropriate data pattern to be able to represent data sovereignty and data security and data ownership and some other topics we'll talk about soon too. So I'd say those trends are happening already anyways.
Sure. And maybe back to what you mentioned with the software platform. So it seems like when it comes to the internet startups and software platforms, they are already relatively more globalized. Really, in the last decade or so, we're seeing tremendous wealth and success around that space. Do you think that the hardware-driven or supply chain-focused kind of like companies would also have this kind of platform when it comes to the scope and the scale? And would startups be able to do that without working with corporates? Like, in internet startups, a lot of time a college dropout, they can just basically write the code from their garage and then build the companies. What are you seeing when it comes to the difference in between the internet type of startups versus industrial tech type of startups?
Industrial is a very different game in fact, OT is a very different game from IT, right? Three things, if we want to really get into it. One, OT is life safety, right? A bug in IT, people are inconvenienced. A bug in OT, and people are harmed or worse, right? Think about a bug in your Tesla in autonomous driving mode, right? You don't want that. The market's dominated on the OT side by a handful of regional, OT players, right? I mentioned them earlier, but ABB, Emerson, Honeywell, Rockwell, Automation, Siemens, Schneider Electric, Yokogawa, just the top 7 we usually deal with, but many, many more. So in some sense, you don't raise a company, you don't partner, you don't get investment, you don't be acquired without touching these companies and the industries that they represent, right? Energy, manufacturing, et cetera. And there's one more dynamic that will round out point 3. Nobody ever got fired for putting in a system from one of these companies in the home country of those companies, right? If I'm going to do a factory in Germany, it's going to have Siemens, right? If I'm going to do it in the US, it's probably going to be Rockwell, right? You can go on and on. So in some sense, it is a bit of a closed market with high friction in that regard, which means partnering is absolutely critical for any young companies coming into this space, knowledge of the domain, but also being able to look early and often for those partnership opportunities, those co-creation opportunities, investment, et cetera, to integrate with those existing systems and not necessarily disrupt those systems, right? These are the digital, if you will, core bed of the reliability, as you said earlier. Nobody missed supply chain until it wasn't there. I could say energy or water or food, right on and on and on. And so disruption means something very different for these industries than it does for IT, right? Where, I can throw out my iPhone because there's a new one that came out now and I'll just throw it away and I'll get the new one, right? It doesn't happen in OT. So it is a very different dynamic respective to entering and working in those spaces. And that's really what Momenta focuses on. That's why we only do this. We don't invest in social media companies or general IT companies or anything else. It's only in OT, only in those 4 sectors, and looking across, the full stack of hardware, edgeware, software, et cetera, that's there.
As an advice to entrepreneurs who are in the audience, if you're looking at this big challenge and you're looking at a go-to-market that requires these big brands, don't think just financial VCs. Think about the corporate VCs that can actually help you with these partnerships, accelerate these partnerships. And here there is an interesting data point. I wrote about it after working with the global corporate venturing team. Half of all the investments made during the pandemic since April 1st, 2020, all the startups that receive investments from VCs or CVCs, half of them was from CVCs that was born during the pandemic. They did not exist before April 1st, 2020. So you have this new wave of corporate VCs that did not exist before the pandemic that are looking at opportunities to invest in entrepreneurs who are looking to disrupt and to create value. And so as a message, and this is back to your question, Elisa, I think entrepreneurs definitively should take advantage of working with big corporations, but possibly facilitated by taking investments from corporate VCs.
That's fantastic. And I think, like back to what Ken mentioned, it seems like in the industrial tech space, there are particular players that really know the domain really well, that truly should be the top priority or partners that you want to work with to really help you accelerate your growth. And when we talk about industrial tech, obviously people have been talking about Industry 4.0 for years, but I know that increasingly Industry 5.0 has been on the center stage as well. And I want to read out a quote that I found through EU that I personally really like. It says that Industry 5.0 provides a vision of industry that aims beyond efficiency and productivity as the sole goals, and reinforces the role and the contribution of industry to society. And it seems like this whole Industry 5.0 concept focuses a lot on sustainability and human-centric and resilience. So I wonder, in your respective work, what are you seeing and doing in this space when it comes to Industry 5.0?
So I think if we could put some context, every revolution, industrial revolution, brings a new level of value to society. So Industry 1.0, it wasn't called 1.0, was all about the mechanized. 2.0 was about the mass production and electrification. 3.0 was all the automation and the computer could bring to automation. And 4.0, like Ken mentioned, is all this data that we are getting and all these sensors and what we can do with it. And 5.0, I see it nearly as a call of duty. It's for us to think about what type of insights do we want to get from all of this data, from all these automations, and do good. And so what I'm hoping is Industrial 5.0 is going to redefine the why we have all this data and what we're going to do with it. And so this is a place where we believe we need to do more. And this is a place where TDK Ventures, part of our mission of contributing to society from TDK and investing in what is typically not funded well or unfunded startups, that's where we want to invest. We want to invest in the startups that are going to have this focus on how do we leverage this data that is really useful, but it's the insights that matter towards sustainability.
Great. So it seems like CVC or basically financial VCs as well really can be an enabler with ESG when it comes to this whole space. How about you, Ken? Industrial revolution came from Europe. So what are you seeing over there at the birthplace now that we're at the 5.0?
So, there's a raging debate among Europe and certainly in the EU Commission whether Industry 5.0 is a revolution or an evolution. Mm-hmm. Sean O'Regan is the gentleman who really crafted and oversees that for the EU Commission, and we've been working with him for about a year now on this initiative and really a lot of the promotion of this. Our simple perspective is Industry 4.0 is focused on productivity or profit, one might say. What Sean's done in terms of Industry 5.0 looks at people and planet. So in my mind, it's going from the 1P of productivity to 3 Ps in balance, right? Productivity goals together with planet goals, together with people goals. And I think it's revolutionary. And I've taken that position, to the consternation of many of my German colleagues, primarily because the question is ESG a fad, or is ESG and clarity among everybody else environmental, social, and governance, right? Are those initiatives really meant to be a reset in terms of how we go to market and do our business? I believe it's a reset. Thus, I believe that Industry 5.0 is indeed a revolution. For those of you who want to hear more, we actually featured Sean on our Digital Thread podcast. We do a weekly podcast. We're about 180 episodes now, but featured him on that discussing Industry 5.0. I think it was late last year. We've also co-authored with him a 4-part series on each of the elements of Industry 5.0, but also culminated that in a white paper, which you can find on our website. In my mind, it's a bold and timely initiative for the EU. And I'm really impressed with the EU's presence in this, and also for what we consider to be digital industry, because I do not believe you're going to make an investment in the future without having a balanced scorecard of profit and then overall ESG balance that goes with that as well. So as far as I'm concerned, this is how we do business going forward.
Do you think that it's really driven by EU, or what are you seeing when it comes to, let's say, North America and Asia and other parts of the world when it comes to this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So look, the EU, Germany particularly, really crafted the Industry 4.0 initiative. Japan came out not too much after with something called Society 5.0, which was their point to say, think about the people in society, right? That industry is part of. And what Industry 5.0 is, took both of those elements and put them together. So Europe has been a thought leader in it. And frankly, because Europe, even though we call it the EU, it's a very separate set of countries, cultures, approaches, business models, et cetera. And so you need a common thesis to align around that. We find the US tends to be a bit of a follower in some of the concepts there. Digital thread is actually a US term, primarily coming out of the defense industry. And APAC generally, we also see watching these trends and looking to see where there's opportunities to participate in it. Again, Japan was in some sense, a co-author of 5.0 because they developed the Society 5.0 approach as well. So I look toward Europe to basically develop that framework, but I look globally for all countries and companies to identify and participate in those elements that make the most sense for them. I don't think anybody's going to argue, though, that ESG is not important to everything that we're going to do going forward, right?
Indeed, profit was really Industry 4.0, but I think people and planet really matters. And Elisa, back to your question about ESG, the way we do it at TDK Ventures is really on the E and S, the environmental and social. And any investment we make, we look at it from the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, SDGs, the 17. And for each investment, we look at which SDGs this project is going to contribute to. The one which is more challenging is a G, for governance of ESG. Because when you talk about startups, you need to have some granularity about what level of governance you want to ask them to think about. And if it's a 2-people startup versus one that just found the product market fit versus the one that's scaling and really getting traction, the governance requirements you want them to think about is different. And so I feel like the E and the S is absolutely in the mind and in all our investment criteria and all our discussions. The G, I think, is where we need to be careful about finding the right touch point and the right pressure points at the right level of maturity of these companies.
Oh, if you don't mind, just a kind of a rebuttal on that. It's interesting. ESG for us defines the outcomes of what the companies develop that we invest in, right? So they'll provide better environmental capabilities, social or governance. For the governance aspect, it's primarily transparency. And anywhere where you digitize a process, you open it up to transparency. So a good example of that, we have a company in Copenhagen called Waste Hero, and they do basically municipal refuse bin management. And one of the big projects they've done is in the San Francisco Bay Area. Imagine the surprise when they started to see the differences between regional neighborhoods of trash collection pickups, trash overflow, et cetera. And you can probably figure out, how those bias. But what was interesting is it was also referenced by the quality of some of the suppliers going into that, including smaller third-party providers versus some of the large municipal ones as well. So that's where we see data transparency actually creating a lot of governance opportunities. And we then can define or at least outline some of the wins from our investment portfolio based on the governance that they provide.
I think that's a very good point. I like what you're saying about the output, the outcome, and to have more transparency, which will drive what I would think is more governance best practices, what we should aim and raise the bar for everyone. I guess I was more reacting to a trend I'm seeing right now from VCs and even corporate VCs starting to add ESG requirements, especially on the governance and diversity in term sheets, irrespective of the stage of the startups. And I feel like we're maybe going overboard or one size fits all kind of approach. Well, I think we need to respect the entrepreneurs a bit more and trust them more and find the right way to support them versus constrain them.
So it seems like, when it comes to the measurements and the metrics for ESG, maybe there are definitely still room for more brainstorming and for improvement, especially on governance. But definitely, I think it's a great starting point for us to all started to pay more attention around things like this. I want to, for the last part of our discussion, come back to this area when it comes to the cross-border comparisons and also the opportunities that we might see if we enable more collaboration in between Asian, both corporates, investors, and startups, and their counterparts in the rest of the world. So in the last 2 years or so, or in your industrial tech space, what are you seeing when it comes to the different kind of like reactions or adaptation, or either the speed of investments or not, when it comes to different geographical focus? And are you seeing very different interests when it comes to what they want to invest into and mentality and so on and so forth? Maybe I'll start with you, Nicola.
So I think it's back to King of the Hill concept I mentioned earlier, which is we're trying to find the startups we believe could become market leader number one in a space that is just starting to exist and become big. And when we look for King of the Hill, we are looking for companies that will take advantage of unfair advantage. And sometimes it's geographical advantage. I'll give an example of Autoflight, which is this company in the back here, which is developing this vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, all electric, and you could call it air taxi because at some point it will transport people. And what we identified when we looked at more than 200 of these companies is you only have two types of companies. You have the types that are designed from Europe and US because they have this Airbus and Boeing discipline and background and network, and so they look more like planes. And then you have all the one that comes from China that looks more like drones. So they are very good at doing the takeoff and landing, but they don't look like aircraft. And when we invested in Autoflight, they were a company that actually managed to combine East and West because they had this drone discipline and skill sets and teams from Shanghai, from China. And also they had a team in Germany that understood how to do aircrafts. And when you combine the two, it ended up with a beautiful, elegant design that could drive better unit economics than any of the other 200 eVTOL companies we could see. And so my response to you is really, there are a lot of things where Asia is going to be first, whether it's a new business model, whether it's new type of technologies. They are going to see things earlier than other places in the world. That's when we want to invest in Asia, is when this happens. I'll use the example of India, where right now micro-mobility and micro-logistics is going to probably start there first before it goes somewhere else. As a consequence, we would want to invest there first in India before we even look at globally, because we believe the King of the Hill is likely going to come from Asia.
So it's very interesting. So for your King of the Hill or Queen of the Hill, you have to basically identify maybe a different regions locally first. And basically, back to what you talked about in the very beginning, predict that local or regional King of the Hill might one day become that global King of the Hill.
This is different, actually. So we look for global king of the hill. So we believe autoflight could be the global king of the hill. But there are times where geopolitical or supply chain or other reasons means that we believe there will be multiple king of the hill for each region. Let me give the example of Ascent Elements. This is one of our portfolio companies that take batteries that have been used in products and they recycle it, but rather than recycling it to different materials, they recycle it directly to cathode materials, which then can be reused to make batteries again. It does not make sense to ship batteries from one continent to another. It just is not sustainable. And so to be able to have global king of the hill also doesn't make sense. It's going to be regional king of the hills, whether it's one in Asia and one in Europe and one in the US, because they can thrive with a local supply of batteries, the feedstock, and then recycle and deliver locally. And this is good for sustainability as well, but it's also good for economics.
Got it. So basically still, I guess, like prioritize with global king of the hills, but when it doesn't make sense for sustainability or other social considerations, then the regional king of the hills might make sense. Ken, what are you seeing when it comes to this East meets West, like collaborations, success stories? What can Asian corporates and investors and startups do more to even participate further in industrial tech? Because what I'm seeing personally is that in the last 2 years or so, a lot of more visible and big deals in this space, I'm still seeing relatively fewer Asian participants in that space. This is just from what I see. So I'm curious in terms of what are you seeing from your end?
So I would probably take exception to your last comment, because anybody who knows SoftBank or NTT Docomo or others know that they have been a major impact across investing in venture capital over the last several years. And now, of course, you've got large PE firms that do that as well. Somebody told me once, and I've never validated this, that 1 out of every 3 industrial startups has some form of Japanese industrial investment in it. And so certainly the Japanese have become masters at doing so and taking advantage where it makes sense, into their own processes as well. What's interesting, let me go back a second before I answer your question, because there's another element when you talk about king of the hill that implies a kind of, I'll call it a level playing field, in the sense that nothing changes. What happened 24 months ago, right? We all got locked home. All of a sudden we're wearing masks, right? Just huge, what the World Economic Forum calls a great reset in terms of labor markets, right? Then, what happened 12 months ago? Well, try to get something through the Suez Canal, right? And what happened, 2 months ago? The tragedy of, Russia's invasion in the Ukraine. And so, we would have called these at one time black swan events, but at what point do all the swans become black, right? And so in some sense, there's opportunities and challenges that every one of those brings in. Look at labor markets. I mean, we've got, I think the last count, 3.5 million Ukrainian refugees now migrating across Europe. And I doubt many of those will go back. So you've got a huge new labor force, and usually very well educated and with good skills and such. So I think that's going to change quite a bit coming up. With COVID, what's the killer use case behind industrial IoT? It's called remote asset management. I remotely manage or monitor, operate, manage, and sometimes even maintain an asset in the field. And you know what? That went from a nice to have to a requirement 2 years ago. Every one of our companies just went crazy in terms of the amount of incoming deal flow they got or commercial activity they had, primarily because they all have that element to them as well. So I'd say, while we look at kind of the broader perspective in a bit of a stasis, these temporal events that come up are creating lots and lots of opportunities. So, let's talk about a couple that people have been talking about: resilience, right? Basically what that means, that's code word for putting the supply chain ends as close together as possible. And, Nicola mentioned a couple good examples of that. But, we're also hearing words of onshoring, words of deglobalization now, right? Things that you wouldn't have said, 3 years ago, right? I already mentioned kind of the labor changes that are going on with that as well. So I'd say One, this learning that we talked about earlier is probably more critical now and done at a regional level than ever before, right? Because the way the Great Resignation in the US and the labor migration, or maybe it's the Great Labor Migration now in Europe, will probably have similar trends and comparable, if you will, opportunities that come out of that. But unless you're in the markets and you see the first order and second order impact of those, i.e., what was the value of Zoom 3 years ago, right? Compared to 2 years ago, right? Compared to one. And so for us, that learning is absolutely critical. So I come back to, you said something really great earlier, and that is that we're ecosystem builders. And that's actually what Momenta sees itself as. We develop ecosystems where we create co-creation opportunities between our limited partners, between the portfolio companies we invest in, and between the rest of our OT partners in the space. And to me, that's absolutely critical because we each get a chance to learn. We each get a chance to help grow these companies. And as part of that, also potentially grow our own companies as well. So, let me give you a good example because we did it in the pre-discussion earlier. You asked about my 5 a.m. calls. And yes, we have at least bi-weekly and now moving to weekly 5 a.m. calls with Taiwan, but it's a leadership team there at Advantech. And what we do is we go through the interesting companies that we have in pipeline to invest in. We look at some of the industry trends going around it. And most importantly, we start to talk about co-creation plans. If I invest in this, how are we going to co-create value? So this isn't the value that Advantech brings or the value the portfolio brings. This is synergy. 1 + 1 = 3, right? What value can we create between all of us? And what I find really beautiful is that we're represented in Europe and North America in that regard. But then I have, senior people, both at the regional and strategic level in Advantech who are telling me, well, we saw this pattern in a deployment we did in China. And here's how here's the ecosystem we had, and here's the outcomes we did. How about we try to apply that pattern here, right? So that ability to kind of pattern match, that to me that's what co-creation all is. So at the end of the day, yes, we'll get good financial return and we'll make lots of great investment stuff. But if we've done our job right, everybody who's part of that ecosystem, our LPs, the portfolio companies, and our partners, all get value, and value that didn't exist before. And to me, that's absolutely critical.
That's fantastic. And I think, both Anchor Taiwan and DIGITIMES were also huge believers when it comes to the value with ecosystem building. And I know that we can go on and on and on with this discussion, and there's still so much that we haven't covered when it comes to industrial tech. I would love to actually get a bit of your outlook when it comes to what you think would happen in the next couple of years in this space. But before we do that, I want to do a quick kind of like fun lightning round and throw out a few keywords when it comes to kind of like the interaction or the chemistry in between those keywords versus industrial tech in terms of your view. So short answer, it could be one sentence within 30 seconds kind of answer. Give me your view. So you guys ready?
All right.
Here we go.
All right, go. 1, 3D printing. Let's go with Nicola and then Ken.
Well, 3D printing is going to be the next level of innovation. And it's a required innovation for everything we've talked about, which means we become more and more regional versus global, which means we need to have things done locally and where it's going to be used.
And just very quickly, are we thinking metal or are we thinking a lot more other materials?
You said 3D printing, and I'm answering as wide as it is. It could be polymer, it could be metal, anything that you need to use locally should be made locally. And the only thing that you should transport in the future are the materials you don't have locally.
Great. Ken?
And that could include concrete. So one of the areas we're looking at is 3D printed buildings, or even the assembly of major building infrastructure offsite but nearby for assembling into larger buildings. The other thing we're looking at in this space is remote part manufacture for maintenance repair operations.
Great. That leads to my next one. Distributed manufacturing and micro factories. Yes, no, maybe.
It's the same answer. You need to have things made where it's going to be used as close as possible. I'm hoping that the generations to come will look back and think, why did we transport so many things around? We didn't need to do that. Same thing.
From my perspective, look, on demand, designer, i.e. the economic lot of one, as they like to call it, all backed by highly complex real-time value chain. So it's inevitable. It's not an option.
Great. Blockchain.
Blockchain is an amazing innovation, creating digital scarcity for the first time in our lives, auditable, but most of the businesses, most of the ideas I see don't need blockchain. So here the key message is only use blockchain when there is a real compelling reason to use blockchain.
All right, Ken.
And since we talked supply chain earlier, for us, the killer use case, smart contracts at the edge.
Great. Battery swapping.
So battery swapping sometimes makes sense, sometimes doesn't make sense. It creates new constraints to your design. And it has to be a good reason for doing battery swapping. And if it doesn't make sense, don't do it. If you think about Tesla, they are going to do batteries as part of the car. Like airplanes, they store the fuel in the wings. So you can't just swap wings, right? So think about battery swapping as a design choice that has to be very deliberate, very conscious.
And Ken?
And I'm assuming you're talking about automobiles. I was going to take a different tack on that. That would bring to mind maybe the service station of the future if you're talking about battery swapping of automobiles. But I was thinking of the edge and think about energy harvesting, right? That's an area that we're looking at quite a bit in a lot of ours because, even though you might have 7 to 10 year battery life for an edge sensor, the cost of that can be extraordinary, not to mention the downtime later on when the batteries start to fade in that regard. So we've been looking at a number of energy harvesting technologies there.
Fantastic. Last one, metaverse.
Metaverse, I think we're just scratching the surface. It's going to be truly impressive what technologies, what use cases, what business model are going to be created in the next 5 and 10 years. You can already see some verticals where the job to be done is so compelling that you can already monetize on metaverse, but we're just scratching the surface.
Great. And Ken?
Man, I wish I could get my head around this topic. To me, there's an awful lot of hype in it right now. But if I'm going to think industrial, digital twins is probably the most appropriate thing to discuss there.
And maybe just super quickly, a couple of sentences when it comes to the outlook with what you are doing.
I think material science is going to build the world and save the planet. And any entrepreneurs in the audience, if you're planning to do something good for the planet, good for society, we are funding deep tech startups.
Great. So talk to Nicola if you're doing such things.
I believe we've only scratched the surface in digital industry. We've looked at this space, invested in this space, activated over the last 10 years. And if I look at the digital transformation journey of a lot of the large OEMs that we work with, industrial OEMs, they're still at the very front end of this, i.e. moving from products to value-added service to products as a service. And with that in mind, I believe the demand for edge devices and edgeware capabilities is at the very front end of it. And I can certainly vouch for that from looking at how Advantech thinks about this market and where they're investing in future. So I'd say for Taiwan, for Asia, globally, this hardware space is just at the nascent end of probably a transformation itself, moving to edgeware.
That's something that I love to hear. So thank you so much, both. And I have really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have and learned so much from both of you. And I hope that this conversation is really just the beginning of a lot more conversations and collaborations to come. And I want to thank you both again. And I also want to thank all of our audience from all over the world joining us for this very insightful discussion. Don't forget to check out the recordings, recaps, articles, our speakers' interviews on Anchor Taiwan's and DIGITIMES social media. And stay safe and stay tuned. Until then, I wish you a wonderful day ahead, and I hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you, and bye-bye.